On December 7th of the year 2000, a 23-year-old assistant basketball coach named Andrew Schreiber parked his 1998 Ford Expedition at a convenience store in East Wichita. He walked inside the store, bought something, walked out again, and then hopped back into his SUV. As he was sitting down, he noticed a man out of the corner of his eye quickly walking towards him. By the time he shut the door, the man had closed the distance and Andrew was staring at the barrel of a gun through the glass window. The man then ordered Andrew into the passenger seat and then got into the driver's seat himself. He then put the vehicle in reverse, pulled out of the parking lot, and drove off into the night with Andrew as his hostage. This incident would be the beginning of a series of crimes that are considered some of the most gruesome in the city's history. And I have to warn you, although this video contains fleeting and non-graphic descriptions of the events, viewer discretion is still strongly advised. Reginald Carr Sr. and Janice Harding had a total of 4 children over the course of their relationship. Janice first got pregnant when the couple were just teenagers, and after finding out she was pregnant, the two of them decided they wanted to get married. Fearing Janice's mother's reaction though, the couple decided to wait until after Janice turned 18. Once she was 18, she would legally be an adult, so her mother could disapprove but couldn't really do anything about it otherwise. Following their marriage, Janice gave birth to their first child, which was a girl they named Tamika. Then they had a second child that they named Reginald Dexter Carr Jr. He was born in Cleveland, Ohio on November 14, 1977. A little over a year later, the couple had a third child, another girl named Regina. Then, around 2 years after that, their fourth and last child, Jonathan, was born on March 30, 1980. During their early years, Janice was a stay-at-home mom and dedicated most of her time to her children. They all lived in a safe, middle-class neighborhood, and for the time being, everything was pretty normal. Unfortunately, at just 2 years old, Regina became incredibly ill for some unknown reason. After doctors ran some tests, she was tragically diagnosed with leukemia. Both parents worked together to bring her to appointments and get her treatment, but this only bought her another year before she passed away at just the age of 3 years old. Despite the tragedy, the young parents did their best to provide their other 3 children with a decent life and a loving home. In the beginning, religion and going to church on Sunday were a big part of raising their family, and Reginald Sr. worked at a factory in Cleveland as a chemist, which was a great job to have at his age. However, the loss of Regina started to take a toll on the couple's marriage. For unknown reasons, Janice began blaming Reginald Sr. for Regina's death, and eventually, their relationship fell apart completely and ended in them getting a divorce. Janice eventually moved to Dodge City, Kansas, hoping to start fresh with her and her 3 kids, and soon enough, she had remarried. This should have been a positive thing, but it wouldn't take long for things to take a drastic turn for the worse. The 2 brothers, along with their older sister, began being subjected to things that no child should. Because of their mother's hatred for Reginald Sr., he no longer played a role in raising them after they separated. Reginald Jr. didn't talk much about his father's absence, and if he did miss him, he didn't show it. But Jonathan, on the other hand, was crushed not seeing his dad as much. He was younger and idolized his dad still, and the divorce had been much harder on him. When their mother remarried, it was right around the time that Jonathan started attending grade school, and Reginald Jr. was around 8 years old. Under normal circumstances, having a step-parent at that age might help to create a stable environment for young children, but nothing about the brothers' circumstances was normal. Janice became emotionally detached and she started frequently dumping them at the homes of relatives to stay for long periods of time. Many of these family members had substance abuse issues, which only made things worse for the children when their mom vanished for days and weeks at a time. And when Janice was around, she was known to be a brutal disciplinarian and frequently resorted to using objects from the home to punish them. And the punishments would escalate to varying degrees of severity that seemed to be based almost solely on the mood she was in. Adding to the physical trauma and abandonment, Janice and her husband and the family they were often forced to stay with exposed the boys to inappropriate behavior. It's thought that this might have been directed at the 2 boys on occasion, but this has never been fully substantiated. In any case, the exposure in itself was enough for both brothers to develop some troubling tendencies at an early age. Jonathan, for example, started having an inappropriate relationship with one of his cousins, and Reginald had found private pictures of his mother and stepfather at some point during his grade school years, which he kept all the way until his early 20s. With so much dysfunction, it's no surprise that both Reginald and Jonathan also began to display aggressive behavior toward women before their teenage years. Some of the first instances of this predatory behavior occurred on girls their mother was paid to babysit. Then, in their teenage years, the brothers started joining various gangs in the neighborhood for that sense of belonging they didn't have at home. With so many negative influences surrounding Reginald and Jonathan, making it through school was one of the last things on their mind. From kindergarten through the 8th grade, Reginald had so many issues that he was kicked out of 8 separate schools. On one of these occasions, he had harassed one of his teachers. This was something he developed a reputation for already by this point. Another one of these was for another assault against a female student. Around the same time as well, at just 11 and 9 years old, their uncle started to allow them to drink alcohol and began teaching them about selling drugs. Then, by the time Reginald was in his early teens, Janice, his mother, was regularly buying drugs for him. Some other troubling behavior they were known to engage in was finding animals to shoot with their BB guns. When they couldn't find animals to shoot, they resorted to shooting one another. In one instant, one of these BBs entered deep enough that it remained lodged in Reginald's head even into adulthood. And this behavior would only escalate as the boys grew older. In December 2000, so now in their early 20s, Reginald and Jonathan left Dodge City and headed toward Wichita, Kansas. After the nearly 2.5-hour drive, the two brothers arrived at the relatively small but bustling city. On December 7th, 2000, at around 10:45 p.m., Andrew Schreiber, a 23-year-old assistant baseball coach, went to a convenience store at 21st and Woodlawn in East Wichita. He parked his 1998 Ford Expedition on the side of the convenience store and then went around the front and inside. After buying something, he walked back to his SUV, not realizing that another person was walking directly toward him at an angle. He unlocked the driver's side door, began sitting down, and that's when he noticed the man walking toward him. He also noticed the man was holding a small black semi-automatic handgun. By the time Andrew had closed the driver's side door, the man had already closed the distance and pointed the weapon at him with its barrel pressed against the glass. Andrew quickly weighed his options, but ultimately chose to open the door, hoping that doing what the man said would save his life. The man then instructed Andrew to slide over from the driver's seat to the front passenger seat. As Andrew started to do this, the man immediately pistol whipped him across the back of the head and shouted for him to hurry up. Once Andrew was in the passenger seat, the man got in, shifted the SUV into reverse, backed out of the convenience store parking lot, and calmly drove down the street. The man then asked Andrew if he had any money. Andrew answered yes and then took his wallet out and gave it to the man. After a short drive, they pulled into an alley where Andrew saw another man also holding a gun. He then approached the passenger side window, and for the second time that night, Andrew had a gun pointed at his head. The man in the passenger seat then ordered Andrew to open the door and to get into the back seat, and again, as he was doing this, he was pistol whipped, this time by the second man, who also shouted at him not to look at either of them. The two men then asked Andrew if he had an ATM card and handed his wallet back to him. He pulled out his card from the wallet and handed it to them, hoping that this would be enough to convince him to let them go. Reginald Jr. and Jonathan Carr may or may not have come to Wichita planning to rob anyone, but once they were there, realizing they were short on funds, they looked for someone to target. Unfortunately for Andrew, he was just in the wrong spot at the wrong time. Reginald, who was driving, eventually pulled the SUV into a bank parking lot and close enough that Andrew could reach it from the back window. The brothers then had Andrew pull out the maximum amount the ATM would allow at a time and hand it to them without looking at them. Eventually, Andrew couldn't withdraw any more money, and Jonathan looked at the bank receipt and laughed that he was left with just $8 and some change. During this entire ordeal, Jonathan had his gun pointed right at Andrew's head, making sure he did as he was told. Reginald then drove north of the convenience store where they first picked him up and then pulled onto Kansas Highway 96. As they drove down the highway, both brothers demanded that Andrew hand over any valuables he had with him. Andrew began taking off his silver watch, and while doing so, turned his head in a way that caused Jonathan to think that he was trying to look at his face. Whether that was the case or not, Jonathan pistol whipped Andrew again and told him not to look at them. It was almost as if Jonathan enjoyed being given any excuse. The brothers then discussed what they were going to do with Andrew and decided that it would be best to drop him off on some random dirt road and then let him walk. The dirt roads they drove down were all bordered by open fields which grew crops in the summer and fall months, but it was in the middle of winter in the middle of Kansas. That night, it was near freezing with winds gusting up to 25 miles an hour. As they passed field after field, Andrew might have been wondering if his frozen body would be found in one of these fields. At some point, the brothers decided that the dirt roads weren't remote enough, and so they turned the SUV back around and back toward the city. As they drove back in, they talked about how nice the SUV was and commented about how they always wanted one just like it. As they did this, they seemed to enjoy looking back for a reaction from Andrew as he thought about the implications of what they were saying. Jonathan then told Andrew that he'd be taking off his pants and shoes when they kicked him out so he could enjoy the weather while he walked. Finally, Reginald stopped the SUV at a car wash and told Andrew to get down on the floor. The brothers decided that they would take him to their original vehicle and wanted to make sure that he didn't know what kind of car they drove. They drove for a little while longer, and then Andrew felt the SUV come to a stop once more. One of them got out and got into their other car. Then Reginald told Jonathan to follow him, and the two vehicles pulled away together. This went on for what seemed like an hour, and then to Andrew's horror, he heard the SUV's tires hit gravel as it started down a much darker rural road. Then he heard the SUV's engine shut off and the sound of cloth wiping down the hard surfaces of the dashboard. His heart pounded as he waited to find out what they had planned for him. After a minute or two, Jonathan told Andrew he could find his car keys on the gravel road after they had left. A few seconds went by and Andrew heard several gunshots go off in quick succession. Reginald then told him to wait 20 minutes before doing anything, and then he heard the sound of them getting into their car and driving away. He then peeked over the front seat and out the windshield and saw the taillights of the car fade away into the distance. It seemed like Andrew's ordeal was over and he was lucky to escape with his life. Thankfully, the brothers had shot out only one of his tires instead of all of them, so he immediately got into the driver's seat and drove right home to call 911. He then told police everything he knew about the incident and the two men. But unfortunately for the residents of Wichita, this was only the beginning. At about 9:40 p.m. on December 11th, so 4 days after Andrew's nightmare, 55-year-old Ann Walenta, a cellist with the Wichita Symphony Orchestra, was heading to her home in East Wichita. Driving a brand new GMC Yukon, she noticed that a newer, light-colored car seemed to be following her, or at the very least happened to be going to a destination close to where she was headed. As she turned down a few side streets and then onto her street, it seemed even more likely that the car was actually following her. Ann pulled into her driveway and watched in her mirrors as the vehicle pulled into the front of one of Ann's neighbors' houses. A man then got out of the front passenger side of the car and began walking towards the driver's side of her car. As the man approached, he seemed to say something, so Ann rolled down her driver's side window just a few inches to hear him better. It only took her seconds to realize how big of a mistake that was. Before she could react, the man pulled out a gun and pointed it at Ann's head through the small gap in the window. In a panic, Ann turned the key in the ignition and heard the grinding of the engine because it was already running. The man then yelled at Ann not to move her car, but she didn't listen and threw the SUV into reverse. The next thing she heard was a loud explosion that made her ears ring. As her vision began to fade, she watched as the gunman ran back to his car. Her vision started to fade to black and her head tipped forward against the Yukon's steering wheel. With her head pressed against the wheel, Ann's neighbor from across the street heard the blaring sound of a car horn. Looking out the window, the neighbor realized that the honking was coming from Ann's house and the hazard lights on her car were flashing. Between the time it took for the neighbor to open her front door and start running towards Ann's SUV, Ann regained consciousness and began calling for help. As she pressed on the wound on her head, she slumped backward in the driver's seat. Then, as her neighbor approached, she yelled to her husband to call the police and realized that the front driver's side window had been shattered and glass was all over Ann's lap. The neighbor then asked what happened, and Ann tried to describe the shooter and the incident, but because of her injuries and how quickly it all happened, each time she told the story, the details were a little different. In those few short seconds, Ann was shot 3 times. One of the rounds severed her spinal cord, causing her to lose the use of her legs. She would spend the next several weeks in the hospital, and things seemed to recover well, despite the fact that she was now a paraplegic. She was doing so well that doctors scheduled her to be transferred to a rehab facility on January 2nd. However, the same day she was supposed to be transferred, she passed away as a result of suffering a blood clot that blocked blood flow to an artery in her lungs. This was as a direct result of the injuries she suffered during the shooting. It's possible that Reginald and Jonathan had killed people prior to this incident, but this would come to be the first definitive kill on their record. And horrifyingly, for the residents of Wichita, this was still only the beginning. 3 days later, on December 14th, a group of friends planned to get together at a home shared by friends Jason, Aaron, and Brad. At the get-together were Jason and his girlfriend Holly, and Holly had brought along her dog. Aaron was also there with a friend of his named Heather, and finally Brad was there too and he was alone. At about 10:30, Holly started to get ready for bed and pulled back her hair and tied it in a bun on the top of her head. Before joining Holly in bed, Jason switched the front porch light off and double-checked the front door to make sure it was locked. A few minutes later, after Jason and Holly had laid down, they both noticed the front porch light turn back on. Then they heard a person's voice they didn't recognize, and then their bedroom door suddenly burst open and they were staring at a man pointing a gun directly at them. The gunman pulled the covers off Jason and Holly and Jason screamed in panic. A second gunman came in the room, holding Aaron by the shirt, and he pushed Aaron onto the couple's bed. One of the intruders asked if anyone else was in the home, and one of the 3 told the men that Brad was downstairs. One of the men then went to get Brad while the others watched them, and he repeatedly asked if anyone else was in the home and told them not to lie. Aaron finally relented and told the man that Heather was in a bedroom upstairs. Eventually, the other man came back into the room with Brad and carrying a golf club and yelled at Brad to get on the ground. The other man then went to the bedroom where Heather was, brought her back to Jason's room, and ordered her to lie down on the floor. With everyone in the house now in the same room, the men demanded to know where the phones were and if there was a safe anywhere in the house. One of them then left the room, searching around the house for any valuables, while the other stayed to watch the rest of them. Holly's dog had also been barking non-stop since the brothers burst into their home, and this eventually got on the brothers' nerves. One of them then threatened to shoot the dog unless they made it stop barking, so they ended up putting a muzzle over the dog's mouth. Next, they asked them for any cash they had on hand and how much money was in each of their bank accounts. Unfortunately for all of them, the brothers didn't just want their material possessions. Once they had gotten all of their financial information, they ordered them to take off their clothes. They then pulled everything out of the closet in the room and ordered all 5 of them to sit down inside and not say a word. After talking with each other for a short time, they ordered Holly and Heather out of the closet and led them to the bar area outside Jason's bedroom. They then yelled at the two women and demanded they engage in relations with one another. Terrified, the women did as they were told, but that wasn't enough for Reginald and Jonathan. Eventually, they brought all three of the men out of the closet and ordered each of them to take turns on Holly. Due to the circumstances, both Jason and Brad couldn't or refused to, but this only angered the brothers, and they threatened to take care of all of them if they didn't do as they were told. They then told Aaron to engage with Holly, but he told them that he didn't want to. One of the brothers then hit him in the back of the head and ordered Holly back into the closet. They then brought Heather back out and threatened to shoot them all again if they didn't perform this time. Holly sat terrified in the closet as she listened as the horror unfolded just outside the doors. Once the brothers were satisfied, Reginald told Brad to get the keys to Jason's pickup truck so he could withdraw money from ATMs. After they left, things only got worse inside the home. Jonathan brought each of the women out of the closet individually and engaged with them before returning them to the closet shortly after. Around 30 minutes later, Reginald and Brad returned, and this time Reginald took Jason out and got money from 2 more ATMs and then returned to the residence about 20 minutes later. When the two brothers began discussing who should go to the ATM next, Holly volunteered. Reginald then ordered Holly to get in the driver's seat of the pickup while he got in and sat in a slouch position in the passenger seat and pointed his gun at her. After withdrawing money, they drove back to the home and Holly asked Reginald if they were going to shoot all of them. Reginald said no, but Holly wasn't convinced by his answer. She then asked him to promise that he and the other men wouldn't shoot them, and he finally said again that he wouldn't. Holly and Reginald then continued to have small talk on the way back, and once they got there and were walking up to the house, Reginald told her that he wished they met under different circumstances. He even went as far as to say he could see himself dating her. Once Holly joined the rest of them back in the closet, she told them that she thought things were going to be okay and that she didn't think they were going to shoot them. Then, one by one, each of the friends left with Reginald went to 1 or more ATMs and then returned to the closet. At some point during one of these ATM runs, Jonathan opened the closet door and asked the remaining 4 if they wanted some whiskey. They all refused, and then after closing the closet door, they heard Jonathan going through their stuff. Not long after that, he opened the closet door again with an engagement ring which Jason had bought to ask Holly to marry him. Up to this point, Holly had no idea that Jason even intended to propose. Once Reginald returned with Aaron from their ATM run, he ordered Holly out of the closet and both brothers took turns with each of them several more times. Then after going through the house again, Reginald and Jonathan began cleaning and wiping surfaces throughout the home to get rid of their fingerprints. Once they were finished, the brothers forced Holly and Heather, who were still naked, into the trunk of Aaron's car. The brothers then attempted to force all 3 men into the trunk as well, but quickly realized they wouldn't all fit. Not wanting to risk dealing with 3 grown men in the same vehicle, they took Holly and Heather out and forced the 3 men inside the trunk instead. One of the brothers then told Holly to get inside the pickup truck and sit on the passenger side, and then Jonathan took Heather and got into the other car. Reginald and Holly then followed the car in the pickup truck to some unknown destination. As they drove, Holly asked Reginald where they were going, and Reginald responded that he was taking them to a place where they wouldn't be able to contact police too quickly. She felt a little bit better hearing that, but also wondered why he wasn't worried about their faces being seen. Holly then looked at the clock in the pickup truck's dashboard and it read 2:07 a.m. The brothers then drove both vehicles to a soccer field where they made Holly and Heather sit in the car while they discussed what should happen next. After a few minutes, the brothers ordered the 3 men out of the trunk and told them to kneel in front of the car. Upon seeing this, Holly cried out that they were going to shoot everyone. Seconds later, the brothers ordered the 2 women to exit the car next and kneel next to the 3 men. Without hesitation, Reginald and Jonathan then shot each one of them from behind. Right before Aaron was shot, he tried to reason with the men, but it made no difference. When it first started, there was lots of noise, but by the time it was Holly's turn, everything had gone silent. She didn't even hear the shot that hit her in the head, and everything just turned gray. She stayed on her knees for a few seconds until one of the brothers kicked her over, then she fell forward and her face hit the cold ground. As she faded in and out of consciousness, she heard the voices of the 2 men who had terrorized them for hours start to fade away. She heard the pickup truck doors open and shut, and then she felt the impact of one of the truck tires hitting her as she drove off. She laid there a little while longer, and then once she was confident the pickup truck and the men inside were far enough down the street, she looked over and watched it drive into the distance. It was only after the taillights were gone completely that she got up and started checking on everyone else. To her horror, none of them responded. She then looked around and saw a house off in the distance with bright blinking Christmas lights, and incredibly, she then ran barefoot without any clothes on for over a mile. She ran through snow-covered fields, climbed over fences, some of them with barbed wire, and finally she reached the house. At 2:15 a.m. on December 15th, Steve Johnson and his wife heard someone pounding loudly on their front door and ringing their doorbell. Steve looked outside the window and upon seeing a frantic and bloody Holly, ran to the door and flung it open. Barely hanging on to life, Holly used whatever strength she had left to recount her harrowing ordeal to both Steve and his wife. And upon hearing that Holly had been shot, they noticed that blood was trickling down the back of her neck and her hair was matted with blood. After calling 911 and making sure help was on the way, they covered her in blankets and hoped for the best. First responders arrived within minutes of the 911 call, and since Holly had been shot in the head, the 911 operator wanted to speak to Holly right away. This way, if she passed away before police got there, any statement she made during the 911 call would be recorded and would be considered a dying declaration. And incredibly again, Holly was then able to provide a fairly detailed description of the two men and told the operator that the two men had stolen Jason's pickup truck. By the time Holly was placed in an ambulance and on her way to the nearest trauma center, county deputies and Wichita police officers were headed towards the soccer field. First on the scene was Deputy Matthew Lynch, who sprinted from his car toward the crumpled bodies laying on the frozen ground. He then checked each one for a pulse or any sign of life, but unfortunately, all four of them would pass away. The only reason that Holly had survived was that she had put her hair up earlier in the evening. This deflected the bullet just enough that the shot wasn't lethal. At around 4 a.m., an officer was near the area when he noticed an older car headed toward him down 127th Street. Only a couple minutes later, the same officer saw the same vehicle driving slowly down the road the soccer field was on. He also noticed that the man drove past the crime scene without even looking over. He just looked straight ahead. To the officer, this was really suspicious, so he then told his sergeant about this, and then the sergeant went to look for the suspicious vehicle. He found it about 15 minutes later and pulled it over and found that it was driven by Reginald Carr. He then questioned Reginald about why he was driving around aimlessly at 4 in the morning, where he had come from, and where he was headed. Reginald told the sergeant that he was looking for his girlfriend's apartment, and then with nothing to hold Reginald for, the sergeant let him go. Just a couple of hours later, a neighbor of Reginald's girlfriend was watching the local news as he got ready for work, and he noticed the breaking news reports of a quadruple homicide overnight. Police asked the viewers to keep an eye out for a gray or silver Dodge Dakota, and as he was leaving for work, his adrenaline started pumping as he saw the exact model pickup parked in an empty spot opposite his car. There was also a large, expensive TV in the bed of the pickup, which also seemed very odd to the neighbor. He was even more startled to see a man in his 20s or 30s that matched the description provided in the news. It was at this point that the neighbor decided to get in his car and drive to the nearest police station. When he arrived, he described what he witnessed to an officer. Shortly after that, law enforcement showed up to the apartment complex, and it didn't take long for officers to confirm that the pickup was registered to Jason. Soon enough, the apartment was surrounded and Reginald had no choice but to surrender. As they searched Reginald for weapons and other items, officers found Jason's gas card, Heather's watch, and close to $1,000, mostly in $20 bills. In the girlfriend's apartment, officers found other stuff that Holly had seen the two brothers take. And if that wasn't evidence enough, Reginald also had 2 bank receipts from 12:06 that morning from Brad's checking and savings account. As soon as Reginald had been arrested, police were quick to announce his arrest to the local media. As a result, plenty of tips started coming in implicating Jonathan as a possible accomplice. Much like his older brother, Jonathan either didn't grasp the severity of the situation or simply didn't care. Whichever was the case, Jonathan did very little to cover his involvement in the crime. He didn't even leave the area, he just called a friend of his and asked her to pick him up from the Amtrak train station. His excuse was that he had missed a train headed to Cleveland, Ohio, and needed a place to hang out until he could buy another ticket. Right away, the female friend found it odd that someone would be absent-minded enough to miss their train. The tickets may have cost less than plane tickets, but they still weren't cheap, especially for someone with no job and barely any money. But in spite of all that, she decided to do Jonathan the favor, picked him up, and drove him to the house that she shared with her mom. Incredibly, at the time, Jonathan was still wearing the same clothes from the home invasion, which were the same clothes that Holly had described exactly to police. Another thing that stuck out in the friend's mind was the fact that after picking Jonathan up, he flashed around $500 while asking if she could break one of the large bills. One thing she knew about Jonathan was that he remained perpetually broke. He responded that he simply withdrawn it from his bank account. That answer made things even stranger because last she knew, not only was he jobless and broke, he never mentioned even having a bank account. Once they arrived at her house, she switched on the TV and began watching what everyone else was watching, which was the breaking news of the horrible crime. Jonathan, on the other hand, fell into a deep sleep as soon as his head hit the couch. So deep that he didn't hear the reporter describing the 2 men suspected of committing the murders. One of the descriptions matched Jonathan exactly. The female friend slowly turned her head to look at him and saw the brown leather jacket, an orange and black sweater, black pants, and brown or black boots. She then shook him awake and asked him if he had seen the news. He grunted a no without even opening his eyes, and then she explained that 4 people had been killed and the description matched him and his brother exactly. Hearing this, even in his sleep, seemed to jerk Jonathan awake. He asked her how they knew what the 2 men looked like. She then thought to herself what an odd response that was after learning your description matched the description of 2 killers. His friend then continued pushing him for an explanation. First, him and Reginald's clothing matched nearly exactly what was being broadcast on every news channel. She then told him that unless he had an alibi, that story wouldn't fly with the police. But instead of responding, tears started streaming down his cheeks, and the only thing he said was that they had gotten his brother. At around 11 a.m., the mother of Jonathan's female friend was watching TV as well, and a breaking news alert interrupted her program to report an arrest in the quadruple homicide. Her knees almost buckled when she heard the name Reginald Carr. The reporter added that they were still looking for a second man who might have been driving an older model white Plymouth town car. Her mother ran to the window, looked out, and was horrified to see a vehicle parked outside her house that matched exactly. In complete panic now, she called for her daughter to come upstairs, all while trying to sound as calm as possible. She then asked her daughter if the police were looking for Jonathan for the murders the night before. Her daughter nodded, and then her mother grabbed her arm, squeezing it until she felt her nails digging into her skin. Through gritted teeth, she then whispered to her that they needed to leave right away. They then quietly exited their house and briskly walked to a neighbor's house across the street. And shortly after the mother began speaking with the 911 operator, Jonathan came to the front door and gestured in her direction. It's safe to assume that the reason they left was written all over their faces upon seeing Jonathan come to the front door. But for whatever reason, Jonathan either completely missed the social cues, or knowing that his brother had been arrested, he simply didn't care. And then a few minutes later, the police arrived and Jonathan burst through the back door. He ran down an alley, but was caught shortly after. Along with the matching clothing description, police found over $1,000 in various pockets. Upon searching the house of his female friend, officers then found the stolen engagement ring that Jason had planned to give Holly. When Andrew, the first robbery victim, saw the two brothers' arrest on the news, he informed investigators that they were the men who robbed him. At this point as well, Anne was still alive and in recovery, so she was able to identify both Carr brothers as her attackers. And Holly, who had spent the most time around the two men, had studied them throughout the entire ordeal, so she was able to identify the brothers right away as the men who had come to their home that evening. Reginald Jr. and Jonathan Carr were eventually charged with a total of 113 different crimes. Reginald was eventually convicted of 50 separate crimes, while Jonathan was convicted of 43. They were both given the death penalty for their crimes. Hello everyone, welcome to Scary Interesting. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to send those directly to the email found in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.